WCF lets you configure auditing either via config file or API. I'll start with config file. The first thing you need to do is add a new behavior. It'll be a service behavior, and you use the service security audit element. This first attribute, audit log location, could be set to either application or security log, and you would find these log entries in the System Windows Event Viewer. By default, whenever something goes wrong with the logging system, such as it fills up, WCF will generate an exception. Now you can turn this off by setting this suppress audit failure to true, and that could potentially protect you against a hacker that knows you have this turned on and generates logging events, which generates exceptions, which could potentially result in a denial of service. The service authorization audit level lets you log events for service authorization, and the message authentication audit level lets you log events for message authentication. Now the options you have are none, no logging, success when something is successful, failure when it doesn't work, when you can't log on, or a combination of success or failure. Next, I'm going to show you how to configure auditing via API. So you would start off by creating an instance of the service security audit behavior. Then you would set the audit log location, which could be application or security log. Then you can set the audit level of both the message authentication and service authentication. You can remove any prior configuration by using the remove option and then add yours. So that's configuration. I'll show you how to do it now. Here I have a WCF service already set up and I want to configure auditing for it. I would go to its config file. And down in behaviors you can see that I already have a service behavior, and I have added a service security audit element. I want the logs to go to application, suppress exceptions. I don't want any service authorization audit levels, and I want to see success or failure on the message authentication. So I've given this behavior a name, and since it's a service behavior, I'll go up to the service up here and set its behavior configuration for that new behavior. And now I have auditing configured, and you can go to the Windows event log and you can see these events as they occur. In WCF, errors from services reach the client as messages that are referred to as faults. Generally, you don't want a client receiving a .NET exception. For example, the client may be written in Java, C++, or any other technology, and so exceptions are technology specific to .NET, and even though another technology may have their own concept of exceptions, they may not know what a .NET exception is. Therefore, you have this technology-independent concept of a fault. So, anytime a WCF service is not able to perform its intended function, it can generate an exception that gets translated into a fault to reach the client. When you're developing services, you can specify a fault contract, and the fault contract gives the client more information about what faults can be thrown or returned from the service when something doesn't work right. Now, you can also provide exception details to the client. However, this is non-standard, and you have to provide special configuration to enable this to happen. This is good for testing though, so you can go and you can do your development on your service and do your testing and then turn this off in configuration later. So now, let me go show you how to use faults in your WCF services. We have a solution with a couple projects. One is a WCF service that throws exceptions, and the other is a client that handles those exceptions. So we'll start off by going to see what is the implementation in the service that throws exceptions. We can see we have a choice parameter on the getTemperature method, and it has a few cases that throw exceptions in different situations. And if the case doesn't fall into the 1, 2, 3 category, you'll get back temperature. Now, let's concentrate on this first scenario right here. What if you've built a service and it throws an exception and it's unhandled? So here I'm throwing a new argument exception, and I'm giving it a couple parameters as a normal argument exception would normally have. So let's go see how that's handled on the client. Over on the client, I have this handle normal exception method, and down here it's implemented to pass a 1 to the service, which will generate an argument exception. Now notice that I have a fault exception handler right there, because any exception that's thrown from the service will be translated into a fault exception on the client. So I'm going to run this. And there are the exceptions being thrown on the service. And we get 3 outputs, but let's concentrate on the first. It says fault exception caught, and this is the message that's coming out of the fault exception giving suggestions. Well, clearly this is not meaningful for a client. So I'm going to show you a better way to handle exceptions from the service to give the client a better chance of knowing what's happening. So going back to the service, this case number 2 is using a fault exception. This is a type that belongs to WCF, and you can give it a reason, and there are a couple other parameters such as a status code and so on, but you definitely want to give it a reason. And you don't want to take the text out of your .NET exception and pass it in there, because you might be giving a potential hacker too much information. But you want to at least give some kind of a message that tells the client enough information for it to decide what to do. So here I'm going to throw this fault exception, and over on the client I have this second case of handle fault exception, and here it catches a fault exception just like the previous example, and I'll run that, and I'll F5 through these exceptions. And in the second message right here it says fault exception caught, you can't pass to. So that you can't pass to is the message, the reason message that the service sent, and it got over to the client okay. So this is better than the first option because it tells the client a little bit about what's going on instead of just saying an error occurred. So let's close that down. Let me show you an option that gives you a little bit more information. There's a generic implementation of fault exception that takes a type, and normally you would want to pass a .NET exception type, but it could be any other type. It could be a string or an integer or whatever, but that's not necessarily as meaningful as a .NET type. So I take this fault exception, give it an argument exception, and pass an instance of the argument exception with it. Over on the client, here's how to handle it. Here we have a fault exception, argument exception, but you're not going to see this being hit yet. I'll show you that in a minute. What'll happen in this case is that it's going to come down here and hit this fault exception, and then we'll be able to print out the message. Let me run this. Here are the exceptions. I'll press F5 to move through them. And notice that we hit this fault exception right here, with the reason being the creator of the fault did not specify a reason. I'll let it run so you can see. The creator of this fault did not specify a reason. Okay, that is not meaningful enough either. But let me show you what to do with this type of exception. Again, we use the generic implementation of fault exception. And you can go over to your service, to the service contract, and add a fault contract to it, with the fault contract specifying the argument exception. So anytime you add a fault contract and you want the information from the exception message to be passed over, then in your service you have to throw an exception, a fault exception, that's the exact type of the fault contract. Otherwise you'll get this generic reason not supplied message. So now that I have that in place, I'm going to build this service. And then I have to go to the client and update the service reference so that the client knows that that fault contract is there. Now the service reference is up to date, and I'm going to run this again. Here are the service exceptions. I'll F5 through those. Now notice that I hit the catch block that has the generic implementation of fault exception of the fault contract type argument exception. And here I'm able to go in and grab information out of this. But see, that message right there, it still says a creator of this fault did not specify a reason. However, here's the difference in when you're catching the generic implementation of fault exception. Notice how I'm checking detail. If it's null, then I go get that generic message. But if it's not null, then I can go into this fault exception. It has a detail element, and I go get the message. And if you can read that, it says you can't pass 3. That's the message that we passed from the service. And if I dig into detail just a bit more, you can see the message, parameter name. These are the details of the original exception message. So you can pass that over that way. I'll press F5 to continue. So now you see you can have a nice, meaningful message. And that's a little bit better than this plain old fault exception because you only got the message there. Here you got the message that came out of the exception itself. Now, we still have this ugly message up here. And you already know that you can use one of these other techniques to improve the client experience. However, you can also get more exception details when you're doing development via configuration. Let me show you how to change that. I'll take these breakpoints off because we won't need them in the next demo. Over on the service, in the config file, you can set a behavior down here in service behaviors and the service debug element. It has an include exception details and faults. I have it set to false right now, but I'm going to switch that over to true and just build the service and run it. Here are these exceptions again. I'll F5 through them. Now, since I turned on the exception details, see this first message? You can't pass 1 parameter name choice. That's the message that was passed in the argument exception from the service. Now clearly you don't want those exception details going to a client that can't understand .NET exceptions. And so whenever you deploy, you'll probably just turn that off and then you'll be good. But what we did here is we looked at exceptions from 3 different perspectives. Just throwing an unhandled exception, throwing a fault exception that has more information for the user, and specifying a fault contract where we could get richer details on the actual exception being thrown by using a generic fault exception. So there you have it. That's fault handling in WCF.